And we'll consider first the context that's going on here. What's happening is Isaiah is introducing the fact that Jacob's going to be restored. Jacob, of course, is Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And so we're talking about Israel. There's a remnant of Israel out there. Israel has been disciplined by God, but they haven't been destroyed by God. They are going to come back. And Israel's remnant in this chapter begins to taunt Babylon. And we want to look primarily at verses 13 and 14 as I believe that it is describing the attitude of Babylon, primarily the attitude of Babylon's leaders that led God to allow Israel to once again gain their freedom from Babylon and master, if you will, Babylon. In chapter 14, starting in verse 13, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north, and I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. And so it's describing here this arrogant attitude that says, well, I'm going to ascend above all of these great and wonderful things that we see, and I'm going to set myself down on a throne over all these. I'm going to be like God in power, in authority. And that's the very attitude that we're talking about being a problem. Now, all of us don't have the opportunity to do it the way Nebuchadnezzar did, or the leaders of Babylon did. All of us don't have the opportunity to do it the way that a leader of our nation could do it, or the king in England could do it, or, well, in this case, the queen in England could do it, or some leader in some nation that exercises absolute authority over people. They have opportunity to develop this idea and to control a larger area than we might. But can we, in our own little spheres of influence, have this kind of an attitude? And the answer is yes. I can become that kind of a spouse, or that kind of a parent, or that kind of a teacher, and almost gain joy from the misery that I dole out to my students. I had a few of those teachers in college that I really honestly think got joy from seeing their students suffer. This idea that I'm going to make myself and exercise the control that I have and not give any concern or care for how it affects you other than just to do it to my good pleasure. And we can all do that in any kind of sphere that we find ourselves in, to where we have some measure of it. It may just be between two people. But I can still have that attitude. Look in chapter 47 of the book of Isaiah. This is, again, speaking about Babylon. It's about the humiliation of Babylon that is coming. And humiliation, not in the sense that we tend to use that word, which means to embarrass someone, but humiliation in the true and absolute sense of that word, which means to humble someone, which is exactly what God did. God exercised his power against Babylon to humble, to bring low, to help them come to realize their limitations and their weaknesses. And in verse, 10, notice what it says. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. What does that mean? You said, no one sees me. There's information missing here that is intended to to simply be inferred by the reader. This isn't just a matter of him saying, no one sees me. This is a matter of someone saying, literally, no one sees me. In other words, he's not amenable to God. Nobody's watching. I can do what I want to do. I don't have anybody to answer to. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. That next line is one I want you to keep in mind. We're going to come back and talk about that for a little bit. But he says, your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray, and you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. Do you realize that last line, you said I am, that is the title that God gave himself. Who shall I say sent me? You say I am. And that concept of I am and there's no one else beside me applies only to the divine. And so that's what this is talking about. This is talking about the fact that they had gotten to the point that they had elevated themselves. They thought that they were above the scrutiny of God, and in fact thought that they were God. You said, I am, and there's no one besides me. And so God brought them low, but that's the attitude that they possess. Now I want you to see right in the middle of verse 10, that line I told you we were going to come back and talk about. Here's where a big part of the danger lies. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. That affects everyone. When we begin to think that we know everything that we need to know, and that we know better. Ultimately, that we know better than God. Every time that an individual opens up the Bible, reads a passage of Scripture, and says, yes, but, and then begins to reason away what it says, that's what they're doing. They're relying upon their wisdom and their knowledge and believing that they have answers that supersede God. That their knowledge is better than God's knowledge. That their ways are better than God's ways. And that can affect every single one of us. And so what I want us to understand is even when we talk about this and apply this to our own selves, forget about other people for a moment. We can elevate ourselves to be our own God and just do what we want to do. And think that we're not going to have to answer to anybody. And say things like, I pulled myself up from my own bootstraps. What does that idiom mean anyway? Ultimately, it means I did it all myself. This success comes because of me and my hard work and my ingenuity and what I... Listen, no success arises from within ourselves. There is a way which seems right to man, but its end is destruction. That's what our ways of doing things bring about. And so James says, don't say, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to conduct business and I'm going to make a profit, I'm going to be sick. Don't say that. Instead say what? If the Lord wills, I'll do this or that. Always understanding that what has to happen in order for there to be true success is God must be for me. If God is for us, then who can be against us? Understand that unless the Lord builds the house, they who build it labor in vain, as the psalmist said. I can build the grandest house in the world. We talked about that a few weeks ago. At Babel, they built some grand and wonderful things. And in fact, God said, we need to go do something about this because if we just leave them alone, then nothing that they purpose to do will be impossible for them. And it's because of that fact that he said we need to go down and do something, because if we are left to our own devices, then we start getting this very attitude that God is condemning in Isaiah 47. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. We start thinking that because we can accomplish these great things, that means that we're great, and that means that we don't answer to anyone, and that means that we're alone. Nobody's watching us. There's no day of reckoning. Look at what we accomplish. It's all the natural world. It's all knowledge that we have ascertained through our own ingenuity and study and consideration. And so I don't have to worry about I am, and there is no one beside me. And by the way, I would also suggest to you that every single nation of mankind that I know of throughout history, if they rose to prominence, got to the point that they said, we are and there is no one besides us. That was the attitude of England. That was the attitude of Rome. That is the attitude of the United States. And it is a dangerous, dangerous attitude. And it arises from this false sense of security that comes from our own wisdom and our own knowledge. And that's why it's so important, if you go back and read some of the foundational documents from our own nation. In those days, they drew heavily from the idea. Even the ones who were deists and really didn't believe that God was engaged with mankind still understood that the only success that was going to be worthwhile and useful would be success that God ordained to happen. And as we went through that one period of actual physical land grabbing, as we moved from the East Coast across to the West Coast of the continent, we actually titled that Manifest Destiny. The idea that we were destined by God to do this ran through the justification for doing it. We can debate whether or not that's the case at another time and another place. That's not the purpose of this class. But I want us to understand that that attitude, though it didn't exist in the beginning, has become more and more to exist. And we're no longer saying, by God's grace we've accomplished this, but they are saying we're the greatest and most powerful nation in the world, and we have all of this money, and we have all of this power, and so we will do what we want to do. And that's exactly the attitude that's being condemned here. And then I want us to understand that though we are not the government of this nation, we can still develop this same kind of attitude within our own little kingdoms, however small they may be. Whether we're talking about our marriages, whether we're talking about our families, whether we're talking about our neighborhoods, whether we're talking about our jobs, doesn't matter. We have to be careful and not to start putting ourselves in the place that God should be. Ezekiel 28. Any questions or comments about that before we move on? Okay, this is about Tyre. The king of Tyre was not a good guy. The nation was not good people. Well, I'm sure there were some good people among them, but when taken on the whole. The word of the Lord came to me, Ezekiel wrote. This is verses 1 and 2. Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas, yet you're but a man and no God, though you make your heart like the heart of a God. And so he wrote to them about the fact, and he's called the prince of Tyre here. We're really talking about the king of Tyre, the leader, the ruler, the potentate, There's a lot of English words we could use there instead of prince. But he apparently was so arrogant that he as much as said, I am God. And the prophet of God was sent to him to tell him, look, what is about to happen, this is why it's happening. Because your heart is proud, and you've said, I am a God. I sit in the seat of gods. In the heart of the seas, yet you're but a man. Not understanding the humility. And again, I go back, and I continue to go back, and I raise this. I don't think I do it every single week, but I raise it pretty regularly. That illustration of that Roman centurion, whom Jesus said had greater faith than any of the Israelites. And that faith arose from the fact that he said this, you know what? I've got people that are under my charge and they do what I tell them to do, but I also have people that are above me, and when they command me, then I have to do what they... He understood that even though he had some authority, he was still just a man. And he himself was under authority. And that, I think, dictated the way he exercised his authority. And it certainly dictated the way he viewed Christ. He understood that Christ had greater authority than him. He understood that Christ could accomplish things that he couldn't accomplish. And he knew that Jesus didn't have to do anything but say the word, and it would happen, because that's the way authority works. And when Jesus said, I haven't seen such great faith in all of Israel, understand that what that means is, at the root of understanding God and understanding our relationship to God and having an exercise of faith in our lives is grasping this authority question. And what the king of Tyre was told is, you know what you forgot? You forgot that you're just a man. And so, Political Science 101, I was taught absolute power corrupts. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's what happened in the case of the king of Tyre. He became so arrogant and so self-consumed in his own right to lead that he didn't attribute it to God at all anymore. He said, I am a God. The authority emanates from within myself. That's really what that statement is. Because understanding the divine nature and understanding the principle that is set forth, book 1, chapter 1, verse 1 of the Bible, in the beginning was God, and what did he do? God created. Understanding that basic principle is the key to understanding everything. If I understand that I was created by God, then I understand that I'm merely a man. That there is something over me, that there is something greater than me, that there is something that I have to answer to. That I don't have all authority or some right to rule inherent within myself. And if my authority is given to me, then not only do I have to answer for the way I use it, but guess what else? If it's given to me, what else can happen? It can be taken. We usually use this phrase associated with life. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But listen, that's everything. If it's something that is given to me, then it's also something that can be removed from me. Because it doesn't arise from me. The only thing that can't be taken from me is what? That which arises from me. That which is inherent to being me. Everything else belongs to the one who gave it. And so the Bible talks about how can the thing formed, molded, say to the potter, why did you make me this way? I don't get to challenge God about how things ought to be as if my ideas are just as valid as his. Don't make that mistake. That's what the king of Tyre did. He began to think that somehow residing in him was some inherent value, and that he was God, and he made his heart like God. Now you notice that last phrase, though you make your heart like the heart of a God. In other words, he convinced himself that he had this kind of right and authority inherent within him. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 22, brings some of this a little closer. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Now, any time that we replace God with anything that falls underneath the umbrella of the things that are created, whether we're talking about mortal man, whether we're talking about birds, whether we're talking about animals, whether we're talking about creeping things on the ground, whether we're talking about some art or imagination of our own devising. I don't know exactly what the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar built looked like. But as I suggested a week or two ago, ultimately Nebuchadnezzar actually was elevating himself to the place of God. And why do I say that? He didn't necessarily build a statue that looked like himself, although he may have, I don't know. But it wasn't the image that was important. It was the fact that he was the one that believed that he had the right to command man to worship, to command what man should worship, to command when man should worship, to command how man should worship. What is that but making yourself God? And that's exactly what's being described here. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God, replaced God with creation, elevated creation to the place that God should be. Whether it's yourself, whether it's some other thing, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if it's a calf or if it's a completely imagined creature, like apparently the idol of Molech was, with the head of a bull and human arms and various other things. It doesn't matter what we create and put in God. If we're taking anything out of creation and putting it in God's place, we're ultimately making ourselves to have the authority that rightfully only belongs to God. And it's so much easier to do than I think we realize. So much easier to do than we realize. We would never bow down and worship an idol. You know why we wouldn't do that? Because we think we're more important than the idol. We're too busy bowing down and worshiping ourselves. Or our knowledge, our science, what we have built, what we have discovered, what we have done. Look at how great we are. Maybe it's our nation that sits in the role of God in our hearts. It doesn't matter what it is. We're taking the creation and we're elevating it to the place that God should have. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says this, Let no one deceive you in any way. For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. That is the end of lawlessness for men. That's where it leads us. When I start walking down that road of rejecting God and rejecting God's authority and rejecting His directions and rejecting His law, it leads me ultimately to sit down in my temple on my throne and make myself to be God. And that's rebellion. And the one thing that is consistently taught throughout, not the one thing, there's actually several things that are consistently taught, but a thing that is consistently taught throughout Scriptures is rebellion will be answered by God. He will not sit idle. He will act. And He will cast the rebellious into destruction. And He's given us several illustrations, if you will, to show us that, yes, indeed, He'll do it, and He means what He says. And I shouldn't start thinking that somehow or another I'm going to do what nobody else before me has successfully done. I know Nebuchadnezzar came close, and I know that the king of Tyre came close, and I know that these guys, they were real close, but I'm going to be the one that does it. That's what Alexander the Great believed. All those guys before me, they came close, but I'm going to be the one that does this. And that's what Hitler believed. And that's what every dictator throughout history has believed. And they've all ended the same way. And so God's response can be seen clearly. We'll talk about that next time. We're getting really, really close to the end of the year. We will not have this class a